Welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today and welcome to our event on disaster service workers and our discussion about emergency response work that local governments take on. This is presented by City Hall Fellows and I believe Michael in a little bit will explain, or if you haven't already explained sort of who we are as an organization and what we do. But at a general level, we're a nonprofit and we're dedicated to empowering young local government employees and driving social change from within local government. My name is Marie and I'm a co-chair of the mentorship committee for City Hall Fellows, and I will be one of your hosts for today's discussion. And with that, I think I'll pass it off to Michael Cox.
Yep. And my name is Michael, and I am a co-chair of the events committee. And I'll also be one of the hosts today. So some general housekeeping before we start. We're going to keep everyone on mute during the moderated question and answer section, but feel free to keep your videos on if you would like. And as a heads up, this event will be recorded and we may put it on our website so that it will be available to everyone later on. Throughout the meeting, we're going to be monitoring the chat. So if you have any technical issues or trouble hearing, feel free to reach out there. We also are going to provide some time at the end to answer any questions you all might have. So if you have any questions for the panelists as we're going along, please write those in the chat and we'll take a look at them and ask them later on. All right.
So I just want to check in. Does anyone have any initial thoughts before we keep moving?
Thank you guys for doing this.
Thanks. Yeah, I think this will be an interesting discussion, and it's great to see a good turnout. Okay, so to begin, we want to provide a little bit of context about what DSWs are and introduce our speakers. Disaster service workers, or DSWs, are public employees called upon to assist with emergency response efforts instead of their normal day-to-day job when they are activated. DSWs provide services and aid during a declared emergency, disaster or catastrophic event, such as during the recent COVID-19 pandemic. Under California Government Code, all public employees are obligated to serve as disaster service workers. And in San Francisco specifically, the city operates an emergency operations center where response efforts are coordinated and centralized. And many DSWs are called to work at the EOC, and their roles can vary depending on their experience and expertise. And today we will be hearing from two speakers who have been serving at San Francisco's Emergency Operations Center as disaster service workers. And Michael will now give a brief introduction for both of them.
Okay. So first up, we have Claire Stone, who is a senior analyst for emergency and executive reporting at the Office of the Controller in SF. She has been working with the city for 6 years, starting at the San Francisco Recreation and Parks Department as a disaster management program officer and data analyst. As part of the city's COVID-19 response, she has served as the deputy chief of the finance section at the EOC, helping ensure local costs for COVID-19 response can be reimbursed by the state and federal government. And next, we have Peter Gallotta, who is currently the communications manager at the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission's Power Enterprise. He has also had 2 stints at the SF Department of Environment, most recently as a public relations and policy coordinator. As part of the city's COVID-19 response, he served as deputy chief for content development at the Joint Information Center and helped develop fact sheets, social media graphics, flyers, and other public education content. So thank you both for joining us.
That's great. Michael, do you want to start us off with the first question too?
Yep. Okay, so first question, please explain in more detail what your role has been as a disaster service worker And what is your usual role in local government, and how did or didn't it prepare you for what you're doing as a DSW?
Well, Peter, do you want to go ahead first? Okay, I'll go first. Well, thank you very much for having me today. I really appreciate it. And I see a lot of familiar faces here and names on the screen. So I had initially worked in the Rec and Park department, where I served in a disaster management role. I was actually put in the safety division as a fellow. So one of the projects that I completed that I was most proud of was a site emergency action plan for every site that Rec and Park has, where there are 264 of them, including 26 full service rec centers, 9 pools, and a lot of fields basically and open spaces. So that really was kind of the beginning of how I started to think about what it meant to be prepared for a disaster. And of course, what we normally thought would be the disaster we face was mutual aid to wildfires, which happens every year and we're experiencing now, an earthquake, or an act of terrorism. So those were kind of the major 3 when I worked at Rec and Park that were focused on. Pandemic was like always the 11th thing down, and you never really kind of got to the playbook. I think especially in the Parks Department, I'm sure DPH did more, but it always felt far and distant. So a little over a year ago, I accepted a job in the controller's office on the emergency management team. And I really thought we would be doing mutual aid and cost tracking for wildfires about from August to October. And then in February, I was riding the N on my way to City Hall, and I got a text message from someone at the Department of Emergency Management, and they said, we're going to need you to go to 1011 Turk, which is the kind of original EOC, the 911 call center. And so I went over to the building, and I've never returned to City Hall as an employee. So it was quick and everything happened fast. I started in the really kind of what probably has turned into the JIC in community outreach in the operations section, before the JIC was even kind of really separated out in the way that it is now in the EOC. And I did a little bit of time there and then moved over to the finance section. So I'm still doing my normal job at the same time, which is a bit of a juggling act. You know, I also do public records and administrative appeals. So I'm trying to kind of figure that out, but that's how I got into it, and that's where I'm at today. So Peter, do you want to tell us about you?
Sure. Hi, everyone. So I'm Peter Gallotta, and just thank you, City Hall Fellows, for organizing this, for having me, and thank you, Marie and Michael, for moderating. And anytime that I get to be on a panel with Claire, the answer is always yes. So this is our I think 2nd or 3rd time being on a panel together for City Hall Fellows. So it's always a pleasure. So yeah, I have been working for the city of San Francisco now kind of on and off for over, I guess, 8 years, really. I started as a fellow with SFPUC in 2011. And I know my fellow cohort member, Jamie Karubin, is on. Hey, Jamie. You know, I started working on sustainability work for the PUC then, and then worked at the San Francisco Department of Environment, and then now actually back at the SFPUC. But most of my work for the city has been focused on kind of climate and environment, but in the context of kind of public affairs and communications and community outreach and engagement. And, you know, in my role now, I kind of serve as a public information officer for the SFPUC. And so I'll talk about my kind of role with the EOC and DSW, but what I wanted to just add is that I absolutely think that the fellowship, City Hall Fellows, really was key in actually, I think, preparing me for not only just my career in government, but I would say even for this specific moment, because I can remember when I first started for the city as fellows, like learning what a DSW was and being like, oh, I had no idea that this was part of our job duties as a fellow. But even as a fellow, we were told you are a DSW, and so I always thought, oh my gosh, if there's an earthquake, I will be called in, and and didn't even really think about all of the all of the other potential events that could happen where our service would be needed. But recognized too and started learning about, I think, as a fellow, this idea of like emergency response and emergency preparedness, which I had never really heard of. But I knew that at the time when I was placed at the SFPUC, that was a core function of the agency, was preparing for potential disasters and how the city would respond, given at the SFPUC as a utility operating services and infrastructure. That is a very important thing. And of course, for the city overall, as an operator, the service provider, preparedness is so key. But in the event of a pandemic, I think it was a completely different kind of an event that certainly I think the city of San Francisco was prepared for, because we have set up, I think, the systems, and we have the knowledge and expertise, and we've built that into the city family. And I would just say the Department of Public Health in San Francisco is specifically I would say well suited to address a public health pandemic, because it has done so before with the AIDS epidemic in the 80s, being a leader, a national leader. And so I think just San Francisco city government is, given our where we are geographically with the threat of earthquakes, and just also the lived experiences of this city I think has prepared just the city government and city employees to a certain degree. That being said, I was thrust in to this work a bit. I mean, I wasn't expecting to be called on, and in March, got a call from my boss saying, "Hey, the Emergency Operations Center needs folks. Would you be willing to step up?" And I think back to the reasons why I got involved in public service, which was to serve. And so I feel like when that call came, I said, well, okay. I was like, it was the middle of the week. It was a Wednesday, I think it was a Tuesday. It was like Tuesday at like 3 or 4 p.m. And they were like, okay, you're going to report in tomorrow morning, like 9 o'clock, or 900 hours, whatever they, using military time. I got very accustomed to at the EOC, but you report in, and you really don't know. I didn't know what to expect, because I'd never been a part of an emergency operations before, but I was called on to support with public information as part of the Joint Information Center. So there was a direct relationship between my kind of day-to-day job duties with the needs of the EOC. And so knowing that, I think, helped me understand, okay, I kind of know what role I might be playing in this, because I'm leveraging my, my day-to-day job duties to help just in a different context. And with, an entirely different team, entirely different kind of schedule, things that you become, responsible for. So I was just thrust into a whole different setting, which was, I think, as concerning as it was to understand what was happening in the world, I think there was a lot of I felt a lot of just concern. But then also you're thrown into kind of this brand new challenge of okay, what am I supposed to be doing, and how do I get things done with a brand new team, brand new process and procedures. But I think in city government, if we've learned anything, we know how to navigate kind of bureaucracy, so to speak. So that's another thing that, like, when we're thrown into these settings, I think for those of us who have worked in government or still are working in government, we kind of know that terrain, and there's a built-in kind of, I think, resilience that we have within the system that we're able to kind of to navigate. So I'll pause there.
Great, thank you, Claire, Peter. All right, so unless, Claire, you have anything else to add, we'll move on to the next question. So this question has to do with sort of balancing, and Claire, you sort of already alluded to you having to balance your sort of usual job and your duties and responsibilities as a DSW these days. So what sort of what are the tips and tricks that you're using? What issues are you finding, and solutions are you employing to meet those sort of challenges, in terms of these issues of balancing all the responsibilities and demands of serving as a DSW worker?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a great question. And I'm interested to hear how Peter's balancing too, because it something like COVID, it changes the structure of the city in a way in which it will change your performance measures. It will change your expected outcomes. It's going to change the resources you have access to. And, you know, from the financial perspective, we're looking at a very seriously strained budget, not just in FY20, which finished in June, but FY21 will be seriously strained with luckily some FEMA reimbursement, but moving into 22 and 23, the first budgeting tool that is going to be used is attrition, right? So we're going to save money by holding vacancies open at the departmental level. So you're going, as your average city employee is going to be expected to move quicker with less and do more with better outcomes, because now the stakes are higher than ever. And I think that's overwhelming, and it is overwhelming to anyone. But you can also look at it as a challenge and an opportunity to strive for excellence. And it's certainly motivating for me to get up every morning and try and get as much done as I can, but then also learning when to pump the brakes and say, this is really, this is going to be a marathon. This is a long, long race. We're going to be in this for, the incident is still active. Whereas, if you look at what was previously known as a long incident, it would have been something that lasted about 3 weeks, maybe a wildfire or something like that. So we're not close to the response phase yet. And there were some things structurally in the emergency protective orders that the mayor issued in March that made it easier for departments to adjust their workload. So one thing that comes to mind is that in the section that everyone skipped over in the emergency protective orders, the mayor talks about admin code section 67, a little bit about public information and the public's right to have that information. So realistically, it's harder to get records and produce records when all of your facilities are closed. So the mayor put some kind of fair but confined regulation around the days in which you are usually expected to provide those records. And now, those are kind of eased. Like there's something called an immediate disclosure request that's now void. So you can't ask for a record in 24 hours, even if it's easy for you to get. We fulfill a lot of those. Now it's kind of taken a little bit of the pressure off public servants. So I think mostly it's balance. It's, I've picked up meditating, which I never, ever, ever thought I would do. And it's really helping. I think it's pacing yourself. It's really forcing yourself to take breaks, take lunch breaks, take walking breaks. Obviously right now we're not spending a lot of time outside, but I know a lot of us have enjoyed the parks, enjoyed the outdoors in safe and healthy ways. So, I think it's just a challenge to see how much you can get done, how efficient you can be. And, it's funny, I've seen this around the internet too. It's like everything that we can transition virtually so quickly, activists and advocates have been asking for certain things to be online for many, many, many years. Well, now we can do hearings online. Now we can do budget hearings online. Now they're accessible to anybody who has a mobile device or a computer. So I do see a lot of the benefits, and it's forcing us to reprioritize as a city. Certainly my department, in the controller's office, we've sent over 150 people to be DSWs, which is more than 50% of our department. So we've had to change around our goals and expectations for ourselves, but I think we're also taking it as a really great challenge to perform. So yeah, Peter?
Yeah, I mean, just on that point, Claire, I think it was for me so incredible to just to see and know that so many, there's so many city employees like yourself who have been really activated from the beginning of the state of emergency from, February, who have either not gone back to regular duties and are just full-time DSWs or juggling both. For me, I didn't share this, but I am not currently activated as a DSW. I served kind of 2 short-term service periods as a DSW. The first was right at the beginning of the shelter in place when I was deployed to join the Joint Information Section and serve as a deputy for content development, and was there for about 3 weeks. And that was right at kind of the beginning of one, that was just when the Emergency Operations Center had moved over to the Moscone Center, which, just to show the scale of this, like the operations quickly outgrew the Department of Emergency Management's office space, which is an emergency command center, or typically a place where they hold, they would bring staff in the event of an emergency. That's on Turk Street, and it quickly outgrew the space. I mean, we were working very closely, Claire, you remember this too, of like how there was a lot of folks packed into a small space. And obviously with the risk of COVID, it became clear that the city was like, we need more space. And we're also going to be bringing a lot more people in to support this operation, right? So that was when it moved over to the Moscone Center. And there you have, a football field size, conference center, with multiple rooms, all of the operations kind of broken out in different conference halls within Moscone. I mean, it was most every level was, rooms, like long tables filled with city employees separated 6 feet apart. It was like all of these mini war rooms in one space. So, I mean, just the operation itself, I think was pretty incredible how it went from a very much a startup kind of environment to a more kind of permanent, longer term kind of operations center. After my first 3 weeks, I went back to my duties at SFPUC, which at that point in time was remote working. And then about a month or 2 later was called to go back to the EOC and serve as the public information officer for the feeding unit. So I was actually embedded in a completely different section of the operations. I was actually in the operations unit and was liaising then with the Joint Information Center, which was actually helpful because since I'd been there before, I kind of knew the JIC and knew how things worked, but I had kind of a new position supporting this new kind of team that had actually been created in light of the need for the city to address a lot of the food insecurity and the need to better coordinate food resources in the city, because at that, in the first few months, and still today, there's been such a huge need to support families and residents with food, especially with schools closed, right? Where so many families were relying on food through day-to-day school. The SFUSD and the city and the food bank had to really kind of step up and really, expand operations and set up, sites and places for residents to actually go and be able to access food. And the food bank, really increased its day-to-day pantry services. So all of that, the city was playing kind of a key role in facilitating and supporting and connecting and kind of collaborating with community, with, nonprofit organizations, among city agencies. So it really is this kind of, it was a kind of a labyrinth though of so many things kind of happening, so many different overlays. And so my second tour was about 2 weeks of time before going back to PUC duties. So for me, I felt when I was there, I was able to really kind of be embedded and, give my day-to-day to the demands of the EOC thankfully having a team back at the PUC that was able to kind of step in and take on some of my day-to-day work. And having a lot of support from my team was really, that was what made it possible, and support from my boss to say, when you're there, you're there. And so that was kind of the expectation, was I'm being called to serve, and that's my new day-to-day job, which was challenging, of course, because my regular job duties continued on, and having to try to support my team. I have a team of 3 that I work with. And so, there's certainly that challenge of also needing to respond to the needs of our customers at the SFPUC, who are also facing, the reality of COVID. And from a communication standpoint, there was a lot of need to engage our customers and also, connect them with resources and support, particularly for the work that I do with our electricity and power customers, to make sure that they were, able to connect to discount programs, resources, and also just know that we recognize this moment that we all find ourselves in, and that we wanted to, reach out. So I think that was the challenge, was needing to, step up to this service and to jump into a brand new role, work with a brand new team in a very short amount of time, and also get my head around programs and things that I had not any familiarity or experience with, while also then holding the work of my home agency and wanting to, and stepping up with COVID response at home. So I think overall, city, so much of our work has changed on an operational standpoint, not even just obviously with the work that EOC and DSWs are doing, but even home agency work has really shifted, I think, I don't want to speak for all agencies, but I certainly know for the PUC, it is, there's so much more programming we're standing up, so much more communications that we're doing to really, serve the community right now. We've launched, we've dedicated dollars and new, making investments in community, trying to support with new, customer affordability programs, because we know a lot of folks are hurting right now financially. And so there's just kind of, there's a lot of new obligations. There's also a new sense of really understanding economic inequity in our city. And I think I'm seeing my own home agency really step up and saying, you know what, we know with, so many San Franciscans who are unemployed, they are going to get behind on their water, power, sewer bills pretty quickly. And we know, even with the program that I work on with Clean Power SF, that about 20% of our customers are behind on their bills. And so what is our role as a city agency to help step in and support folks right now, if we have the means to? And I think an agency like the PUC is saying, we feel it is important right now to invest in our local communities, and provide really direct economic relief when and where we can. So that's been a huge, I think, shift in priority and focus from an agency standpoint, and aligned with kind of the larger city response.
Great, thanks. We have a quick question. I know we said we would save sort of the Q&A for the end, but I think it makes sense to ask this question sort of earlier rather than later. But either Peter or Claire, either one of you, could you sort of give an example or sort of paint a clear picture of the delineation between the types of duties and the work that you're doing as DSW and as sort of like your permanent full-time, government job? If you want to refer to the exact question, it's in the chat.
I can talk a little bit about that. So the San Francisco Charter, which is essentially like the local government's constitution, mandates that every city employee, which we have 34,000 of them, is required to serve as a disaster service worker. Often it's known as DSW, and sometimes your employee identification number is known as your DSW ID. It basically is this thing that we say all the time that we think will never happen to us. And look at me and Peter now. Here we are. We are DSWs. So you can get formally deployed by your own department, or you can essentially get commandeered by another department. The best example is the one that we have right now. There's about 400 active DSWs and disaster service workers, and I'd say about 275 of them are reporting to Moscone Center right now. The remainder of them are hotel site monitors. So they are managing the places where people are staying, either unhoused folks and or doctors or nurses who have been exposed to COVID-19 in the workplace. So a disaster service worker in theory is supposed to work exactly how Peter described. It's supposed to be where we take Peter from the PUC and we borrow him and we assign him to an operation that is completely unrelated to what he normally does, though the PUC is experiencing COVID-19 like any other department. And the beauty of the DSW, disaster service worker function from a financial perspective is that the PUC is still paying Peter's salary. And if Peter was to work any overtime, I assume that he's now represented by the MEA union, though it could be Local 21.
Local 21.
Local 21. So if Peter was to do any overtime hours, for instance, he's a hard worker on a Tuesday, maybe he worked till 9 and he was supposed to leave at 5. Peter, what are you doing? Those 4 hours are reimbursable by the federal government. So the PUC would basically gift Peter's hours, and then the federal government would pay 75% of that. And then we'd hope that the state would pick up what we call the state share. And the state is in a really bad financial situation right now. So with DSWs, they're actually only picking up when we moved to a new structure. So we're in a unified command structure now, which means that we have multiple commanders, essentially, and we have multiple people in charge. Before we were in just one structure. So now Peter's hours wouldn't be reimbursable. It's kind of messy and in the weeds. We don't need to get into it, but essentially it's for disasters. All employees can be called. But what we saw was actually that the DSW and the activation became very political. And it also became something where in COVID-19, rarely was someone really forced to be a DSW. Whereas we had always traditionally thought that it would be something you had no decision in. This actually, we saw that there was a series of discussions around if someone's temperament, personality, and work ethic was appropriate for the role. That's my comment on DSW.
Okay, I guess I'm more interested in, like, you've clearly described the financial aspect of it, where it's basically a thing between local, state, and federal government. But I'm more interested in, like, what does DSW do, like, relative, like, is it just like a separate agency with their sole purpose is to address the crisis, and therefore they have their own, like, initiatives completely separate from your own job, or is it just like, I don't know what to compare it to, I guess.
No, it's a good question. So what I would say, and Claire jump in too, is the way that the city of San Francisco has a department, a dedicated department that is dedicated to emergency response and management. So the Department of Emergency Management kind of is activated when there is a state of emergency. And so the Mayor Breed issued a state of emergency in February. And so then what DEM then does is work with DHR to then understand the resource needs to stand up the emergency response. And that is when the DSWs, the disaster service workers, are then activated. And you're activated based on, I mean, there's very specific, there's often kind of just specific needs and duties that they're looking for. I mean, because the units are broken out at the EOC kind of roughly, and I'm going to miss some, but there's like a planning section, there's a operations section, there's kind of finance, there's logistics, there's information, joint information section, and then there are probably some others that I'm missing, but so they're basically all of these kind of flanks within the larger command structure. It's very, I mean, it's very, for a lack of a better comparison, very kind of military style, where you have a command structure. There's chiefs, there's an operating, there's an operations manager and a chief who oversees the entire operations, and then all of these sections. So DHR works to kind of resource the different sections. And then what we do, our job duties, there's no job description There wasn't when I started. We just, showed up and I was told, okay, these are the needs that we have. And you have some city employees that get thrown into different sections. They might not have a lot of direct experience with that particular, but they are needed to either do administrative tasks, whether it's, you're using your city issued email, you're using a city issued computer, and you're then just part of a new team and unit that then has objectives and deliverables, and then you're assigned something to do, and you have to figure it out in many ways. So that's where, some of the DSW, I think the resourcing and the assignments, it wasn't always, sometimes it was kind of a circle with a square peg a little bit, but, and sometimes people roll in and roll out, and after a short service, and, it may not exactly have been a right match, but it's part, I think it's a little bit of that trial and error process of kind of understanding, who's available, who's able to be deployed, and who's able to perform the duties that are needed. And it's not a perfect, it's not a perfect system or a perfect science. And that's, and kind of government, there's certainly, some challenges with efficiencies, but it's also a pretty amazing system, as Claire was saying, because you're leveraging an existing staffing pool to be able to, stand up something very quickly, and have impact in a very quick way.
Okay, so you're saying it's basically like a command structure, temporary agency to do a specific thing. Okay, got it.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah, and the emergency protective orders that Peter referenced were signed in, there have been multiple now, but were signed in February and in March. That activated a certain type of emergency, which they use the incident command structure system, sometimes known as ICS, which was developed, it sounds like the military, but it was developed in 1970 to fight wildfires across counties. Mm-hmm. And it kind of dictates that structure. Every component that Peter described is outlined in this structure. So if you're a city employee, or you have been, you probably took incident command structure 100 and 700. And, you can go on and take more courses and learn about, the role that Peter served in is outlined in the incident command structure. There was just not a lot of time to go into the kind of history and details of the role because we had an active emergency on our hands. So, yeah, you can always research that, and it will tell you a lot about how and why we make the decisions we're making right now.
Cool, thank you.
All right, cool. So one last question from me. Both of you have kind of talked about making information accessible to the public. And I'm curious, given how diverse San Francisco is, what ways you all collaborate with the community to make sure that everyone has access to the information that they need in an emergency.
So yeah, it's a huge challenge, and it is also so critically important. And in a pandemic, in any emergency, knowledge is power, communication is power. People need to understand what is happening and what they need to do. And that's really the role of, in this case, government, to play that role of kind of chief communicator. And so as Marie knows, because Marie was also at the Joint Information Section, we really try to leverage as many channels and pathways to get the word out as possible. One key, is the media. The media is extremely helpful. Sorry for the background noise. Is extremely helpful in helping us get the message out to the community. So there's a whole media relations team that Marie was helping staff to triage with media, constantly coming with questions, with press briefings daily in the beginning with the mayor and the leadership of city leadership was briefing the press daily in the beginning. My second week, or really my fourth day, was when the shelter-in-place order went into effect. And this was unheard. I mean, I had never heard of something like this before. I actually didn't know that cities had the ability, or counties had the ability to even to implement something like that, right? Which is, and so we had to very quickly get the word out to thousands of people in the city to say, y'all got to stay home, and here's why, and this is, you know, and this is in effect. And so it was I just remember when that happened, and we were like, okay, how are we going to do this? So we marshaled, you know, we text message alerts, the media. We immediately jumped on getting information translated, right? Because that's so key in San Francisco. We already have a language access ordinance that requires us to translate in, you know, in 3 primary languages, well, 4. So we have English, Spanish, Chinese, and Filipino. But at the JIC, we were also translating into Vietnamese, Arabic, Russian. And so any communication, whether it was a public health order, whether it was a social media post, whether it was, you know, to some degree a press release, we were getting that information translated. And we had on-site translators, actually city staff, which is pretty amazing, right? Where we leveraged city staff to help get this information translated and then disseminated out into the community. And doing that, you know, on a dime, because there's such an urgency and a need every day as things were changing, particularly in the beginning. You know, we were out there communicating one thing one day, things would change the next day. We had to pivot and respond and communicate something else, or clarify something because the media might have reported it incorrectly, or the governor came out with something, and how does that compare with what San Francisco is doing? So you're just in a constant state of response, and trying to stand up, being proactive becomes really hard. It becomes really, really hard. And in the, you know, successful communications rely on both a reactive strategy and a proactive strategy. We were really hamstrung in the beginning of getting out there proactively, but thankfully, with the kind of the network we have in the city, between city agencies getting word out, again, the media helping us get the word out, and community groups. So grassroots was key. So the last thing I'll say is just that the EOC had a whole branch that they stood up that works very closely with the Joint Information Section. It's called the Community Branch, where there was outreach liaisons that would go out and door hang about, you know, the messaging of stay at home, and you know, make sure to stay socially distant, and cover, you know, use a face covering. All of that information was also directly, you know, communicated to residents and businesses through outreach liaisons that basically fanned the entire city to also help get the word out, which is pretty incredible. And I think that's something that San Francisco really is able to do, partially because of the size of our city. We're not, you know, we're not New York, we're with 8 million people, we're 850,000. We, you know, we take care of our community. We're connected with our community groups. Our community groups really have a channel in with government, and that's so key in these kinds of situations. And so we were able, a lot of that connectivity really helped in this moment, because the community groups were able to serve as liaisons and help get the word out to particularly vulnerable communities, and also our non-English speaking communities, and also help be trusted spokespeople, right? And trusted liaisons in the way that sometimes government and even the media or other channels just can't.
You know, I noticed that you said something before about food security. So I'm just wondering, just like in general, excluding the fact of the medical emergency that's going on right now, what's the state of our city in terms of like general necessities for our people? Like, how about just like I don't understand this food security thing, but I've heard a lot about it in the news recently, especially even in China. I don't know, I just read the newspaper this morning. So how's like generally food security for the people of San Francisco currently?
I can speak a little bit about that. So Peter talked about the feeding unit. So the feeding unit is active and has been active in the San Francisco's emergency operations since March. And, you know, typically San Francisco does have a major operation surrounding a nonprofit partner which has a city contract called Meals on Wheels, right? So a lot of us know Meals on Wheels. It takes hot meals to seniors. And what we've basically done with paratransit and a fleet of city employees is majorly expand the operation for Meals on Wheels so that it won't just be seniors receiving meals. It's also people who are immunocompromised and cannot necessarily leave their house for the food resources that they need. So, and you know, I was talking with Michael earlier when we signed on, and Michael's working at BART right now. Some people in San Francisco live in a food desert and don't feel comfortable getting on transit. And maybe they need a little bit of assistance. So it's a scaled response, but food is also something that has been consistently reimbursable. So food as the item, as the good, but also staff working on food initiatives is reimbursable. So there's really no reason why a local jurisdiction in a state like California wouldn't continue to expand their food operation as we see a deeper recession and we see government budgets shrink. We'll still see an expansion of food. So Peter, do you have anything to add to that on food?
Well, I would just say that, you know, pre-COVID, you know, 1 in 4 San Franciscans, you know, dealt with hunger, which is a significant amount of our community. And so, you know, COVID just really exacerbated, you know, I think that need that was already there in the community. So it was it became immediately clear that it needed to be a priority as part of the emergency response. And even just seeing the difference when I was there at the EOC in March, which was really, at that time, was really flatten the curve, stay home, right? It was just really, you know, people protecting themselves and their public health, right? There were some really immediate actions we needed the community to take. But then when you're shutting down everything and you're telling people to stay home, what other needs does that create for folks? And one of them was certainly, how are folks going to access food? You know, seniors, you know, folks, particularly vulnerable communities, and also families that were relying on, as I mentioned earlier, on our schools. Our schools are one of our biggest actually resources in terms of food service delivery to the community, because for a lot of families, you have breakfast and lunch, you have 2 main meals that are provided every day by our school system, right? So with the absence of that, it became clear that the city needed to really step in and make it as part of the emergency response. And so thankfully there's funding, our ability to invest in those programs is reimbursable. And also the state was helping with infusing some money. When I was at the feeding unit, we stood up a program called the Great Plates Delivered program, which was helped meet the needs of seniors who are, you know, encouraged to stay at home, and helping them get three fresh meals delivered at home every day. And thanks to the state's, you know, partnership with San Francisco, we were able to get that program, and we were able to the city was able to partner with businesses to help bring some businesses back. This was before more restaurants started reopening really fully, but it was a catalyst to help support our business community and help seniors in need. So there was this kind of really great, what I would call even an innovation, if we could say, in this moment of just starting to connect dots of how do we, you know, start helping support an economic recovery while also supporting our, you know, communities that are most in need, and addressing, you know, food and hunger as a primary response, you know, from the emergency operations.
Okay, thank you, Peter and Claire. So I just want to be mindful of everyone's time. We are running short, and I want to make sure we get to just a few questions that we did receive from other guests. So to begin, we have a question from Anna Garfink. So very briefly, if Peter or Claire or both could address sort of what that shift looked like between sort of the disseminated command over to unified command. Sort of how did you see, like, what did you see change? Sort of what's your assessment and analysis of like whether that was for the most part beneficial, or, you know, if you could just walk us through sort of what that change looked and felt like to you. And then also very quickly, I'll just go ahead and read her second question is, Ed, if you were in charge of the EOC and the unified command structure, I guess, following up her first question, like what would you perhaps do differently?
I'll start us off here. First of all, I do not want to be in charge of the unified command structure, so I'm really chilling on that one. I'm good. It's a tough job. It's a thankless job. So I'll talk a little bit about the command structure briefly. We started in January, early January, right after New Year's. The Department of Public Health had been monitoring the spread of COVID-19, which didn't really have its name, in Wuhan. And then they activated their DOC fairly early. So DOC is Department Operations Center, so Department of Public Health kind of started. SFFD, Fire Department, was kind of closely behind. And then in late January and mid-February, there was a daily 24-hour-a-day activation of the Emergency Operations Center, the EOC. That's when it was at 1011 Turk. And that structure, when the EOC was activated, existed before the mayor declared a local emergency. So then the next step was the mayor declaring a local emergency. And that was March 17th when the stay-at-home orders began. And the state declared 2 days later on March 19th. And shortly thereafter was the federal government. So then we had basically what would be referenced as a standard Stafford Act declaration of emergency. It was from the federal government all the way down to the local, but the local started it, which is usually how it goes. So it goes up to the federal and then it goes down from the federal. So we existed in that structure then from March until July 12th, I believe. And that's when we switched to the unified command structure, which means that usually it's used for multi-county incidents, so usually wildfires that cross boundaries, and it's really to adjust staffing and adjust costs. And this, we've taken it and we've really, the emergency management purists hate it, but what we've done is we've said we have 3 departments in charge of this emergency. So we have the Department of Emergency Management, we have the Department of Public Health, and we have the Human Services Agency. And there are 3 unified commanders, and they each have a vote on the operation, and that steers essentially and guides the decision-making of the operation. It's August now, we switched in July. I think that the structure is great. I like it. I don't think it's the time to really be able to kind of judge. It's too soon. It's a unique structure, so other counties are not doing what we're doing, but we're also both a county and a city. So we really get a lot of agency about how we make decisions and how we want to manage our operation. If you look at a place like Los Angeles, it's had huge outbreaks. The county has public health orders that the city of LA has to follow. And a city right next door to you might feel differently or be doing something differently. And there's really nothing you can do about it. And the county has to try and make everyone happy. So there are real benefits to being in San Francisco. We also had a rainy day fund. The unified command structure, I'm not sure can be judged, but it was probably the best that they could do in terms of structure. Peter, do you have anything to add about the structure of the incident?
I mean, I think it was just really, for me as a first time, DSW, it just was really interesting and a learning experience to see how it's all structured and just kind of getting used to the reporting structure. I mean, there's a lot of reporting, there's a lot of paperwork, there's a lot of tracking everything from when you walk in, you sign out. At the end of the day, you log everything you do. This is for reimbursement, as Claire knows, which is very important, but it's a lot of, there's a lot of structure. There's a lot of structure and documentation that is really needed. And so, so it's sometimes it feels, there's just kind of an additional different mindset you kind of have to be in. When I first was there was report outs every basically 3 hours, 9 a.m. at noon or 1 in the afternoon. And so everyone comes into these briefings, right? And I know that they started, I think, reducing the number of briefings, but that's really traditional ICS, is you have these report outs because everyone needs to know what everyone else is doing, right, for an effective response. So there's just a lot of communication, reporting internally, documentation, and I think it can be a little bit overwhelming for like just being thrust and thrown into that. But I think then you kind of understand that why it's important. And also for the records, I mean, I had heard that, and Claire could probably speak to this, but I had heard that after other past emergencies that FEMA reimbursement can take years and years. And the documentation of every hour we work, it needs to be documented in order for us to be able to reclaim those funds so that we can actually, the city isn't on the hook for it. And I think post-Katrina and a lot of other national, incidents, it can be a while. It can be a long time. So it's really, when you understand understand why it's so important, then you kind of suck it up and you do those daily logs, because you understand the reason behind it.
Yeah, and one more thing I'll just add on that to kind of close out that question is San Francisco is amazing for a lot of reasons. One of the reasons is that we've hooked up a lot of our forms to our timesheets and online, so we've automated a lot of our reporting on those things. But also, I'm here talking about incident command structure, and you have basically 2 queers on your panel here. And, nationwide, you're not going to see anybody operating an incident command structure who isn't like a white dude with the gun, basically. Yeah. So there's a lot to be, there's a lot to notice in San Francisco, that we do things differently here, that the Department of Emergency Management is run by a really small but fierce woman. You know what I mean? Not saying that it's 100% perfect, but it is definitely unique. And I think that we sometimes forget to celebrate the fact that, people of color, queers, females are at really the leadership of this incident. And, this is an exciting place to be fighting COVID-19.
And I would just add to that there was we have an equity officer embedded within the EOC operations when I was there. And I believe that's transitioned over to the new command structure as well. And that's pretty, I think, incredible. Yeah. To your point, Claire, absolutely.
Yeah, and it doesn't exist in the structure, right, Peter? So like we're changing things, and hopefully we're going to change things at the national level too. So there's a lot that San Francisco is doing that the country is noticing. So it's something to be proud of.
Awesome. So last question we'll try and squeeze in. So Joyce asked, could you both speak to how you worked through challenges of bringing your skill sets and experience and applying it to a new environment that might lack direction and is constantly changing? How do you learn from your role and effectively take initiative during times of great uncertainty?
Great question, Joyce. Not surprising. I would say, I think you really, in these settings, for me, I feel like I rely on a lot of soft skills to be 100% with y'all. I think that the hard skills are helpful in doing the job to some degree, right? Like in my communication skill set, I'm able to draw on it. But in these settings, it's the soft skills of listening, of, relationships, understanding, who you're working with, understanding where your colleagues are coming from. There's people who walk in the door at the EOC. So I was kind of thrust into a management role, and was managing a team of graphic designers, translators, and content specialists. So, I went from a team of managing 3 people in my day-to-day and was thrust into managing a team of like 15 to 20 people who I didn't know, who were of all different ages and experience levels with the city, some longtime city employees, right? And so here I am, I'm 33, and here I am kind of like, I'm now kind of leading this group or trying to help steer the group. But I think that for me was kind of my understanding of kind of walking in with humility of like, I don't really know what's going on, but my job is just to try to do the best I can to, support this group of people, provide some direction and guidance, and also kind of follow the objectives of this situation, right? So I was kind of getting objectives from our chief, who I think one of the first things he has given to me was like, we need a campaign for seniors and older adults. And so I was like, okay. And so here I am, I'm like, how do I tackle this? Okay, let's pull some people together. Let's have a meeting. Let's kind of strategize, and then let's start putting some things together and leveraging the expertise that was in the room. And so it's kind of just, I think, again, I fall back on that soft skill of just, it's problem solving. I think that was very helpful to kind of understand, okay, here's a challenge. How do we solve this? And how do we solve it using the resources and human resources and the additional resources we had available to us in this context? And also, how do we support folks? I mean, this was also, I felt very strongly about needing to support the team of folks that I was working with. And you get bonded because of this shared experience, right? You come very easily bonded because you're showing, for many of us, we're showing up to work when most of the city is staying home, right? So you're also kind of putting yourself out there and you're showing up, and other people are too, and other people are leaving their families and kids and so I think it's just also leading with compassion and empathy and a real just kind of awareness. Again, that soft skill of just kind of self-awareness and group awareness to really be able to, I think, be effective and, kind of meet the moment that you find yourself in, and also build relationships. I've walked away from that experience now with connections with other actually comms leaders. I got to work with Mayor Lee's former communications director, who was a badass and was amazing to work with. And I learned a lot from her. I met the communications director for the Human Services Agency, and we hit it off. And we've now have we've stayed in touch post, and I've met some others, just amazing city employees, because that actually, I think, is the beauty of the EOC, is just, it builds more connectivity within the city family that I think is so, is helpful long-term beyond this crisis.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, you get to meet great people. I think that so I've been deployed this entire time. And I think that you are keenly aware that you're existing in a space where title is king or queen. And I think something that I've had to really deal with, and as as a young woman who's trying to come up, who's really hungry, I wanted the title, you know what I mean? And I had to kind of convince myself, okay, hey, these things, they might matter in this environment that I'm in right now, but what is really the focus of what we're doing here, right? And credit and all of those other things can really get in the way in an operation where the structure is messy. And I think you have to really remain humble and remind yourself why you're there every day. So those interpersonal dynamics and challenges, they still exist in an emergency, and people are hyped up on adrenaline. Maybe they're not getting enough sleep, they're working longer hours. So I think, to Peter's point exactly, my soft skills are what have come out. My humor, my dark humor, my funny, stuff that anything I can contribute, what we all love to do, right, is share food and share with parties and social gatherings. We haven't had any of that, right? There's the Zoom happy hours don't really step in for someone's graduation or someone's birthday party. So I think it's been really a balance of, like I said, it's a long mental game, and not letting any of your ego or any of these other competing factors that are probably going to cross all of our minds in the way. And at the end of the day, remembering that there are a lot of people in this country and in this city right now that either have lost their jobs because of industry or are going to lose their jobs because of the pending recession that we have. So finding gratitude in what I have in a job with benefits, remembering what my skills are, remembering that I'm still actually striving for excellence and trying to continue to grow in the city, and really staying grounded and remaining humble, I think were the skills that I've had to tap into most in terms of kind of my long-term view. So.
Hey, I do have one more question, and this is actually a pretty good closing off question. Can you
Sure.
go ahead and just give me like an overall summary of like the overall public health, social well-being, and economic factors of our city?
I'll hand that one off to Peter.
Can you restate the question or just
Okay,
say?
so currently I just kind of want to know more about the current state of our city.
Right.
So can you go address the overall like state of our city in three factors: public health, social well-being, and financial economics?
Whew,
Yeah, that's it.
thanks,
That
Claire,
is a
for that.
big question.
I can do the
So thank
finance.
you for trying to take a stab at it, but that I think that that's enough for like a whole other question. But if you want to take a quick stab at it, we do need a wrap up.
Yeah. I mean, I would just say that I would just in very high level, just say that we are in a very different place as a city than we were obviously pre-COVID-19. And I mean, that's maybe a statement of the obvious, but I don't think, as much as we've been able to kind of meet this challenge, we are not, we are a long way away from being really through this and out of this. And I just think, I'll just say quickly, when I first started at the EOC, I thought we would be in shelter in place for maybe a month, 2 months. I thought things would return back over the summer. I mean, I just felt I was just not really prepared, right, for the long term of this and also the real impacts. I mean, we're seeing really devastating economic impacts for our city, small businesses. So not to leave on a kind of a dark note, but I just think we're not through, I think, the kind of really the worst of it yet. And we are going to have a long, I mean, we're even, from a city standpoint, we're kind of in the process of transitioning from response to recovery. And recovery is a whole other conversation, which speaks to kind of, how do we build back from a public health standpoint, from a social well-being standpoint, and an economic standpoint. That's really the work that is going to be coming next and is already underway. And I just think we're going to see a San Francisco that's reshaped by this event, by this public health pandemic. I do, and I have hope for our city, and I know we will recover, but it is going to take time, and it's going to be there's going to be some challenges when we look at the budget specifically of how we get out of this and get through this and are able to support our communities. There's more people in need. The city already had, and I was going to touch on this, the disparities. COVID has exposed our fault lines in our system, and there's even more need than there was when we were in boom time. So what does that mean for us as a city? I mean, this is where we need help beyond just local government, right? And so if there's any glimmer of hope, it might come after November, I think for there to be more support and relief for state and local governments so that we can recover.
And I'll just add to that, we really need a second stimulus package from the federal government. So let's go ahead and continue to advocate for that. And, whatever your vote is, get out there and vote for your local, vote for your state, vote for your federal. So Marie and Michael, we really appreciate you having us here tonight. And Peter, it's always a pleasure to be on a panel with you.
Likewise.
Okay, so thank you so much. We've gone a little bit over time and I want to be mindful of our speakers' time. They are very, as we've heard and seen, very hardworking public servants who are activated DSLB workers, so they probably want to get on with their evenings and get some well-deserved rest. So thank you so much, so much respect and admiration for the two of you. And I know, speaking for myself and probably for the rest of the group, we've learned so much. The city has learned so much. We will continue to learn and hopefully use all of these great lessons to help each other and recover from everything and get out of this state that we're in. So thank you so much again. Thank you everyone for joining. And if anyone has any follow-up, I think the invites might have provided the email for City Hall Fellows. So feel free to provide feedback or any follow-up questions via email. And with that, I hope everyone has a nice and wonderful evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you, everyone.
Marie, Michael.